Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coffee and Open Source. I'm your host, Isaac Levin, and I'm super excited today because we're going to have a great conversation about some really cool tech and learn some fun things about our guest along the way. Today, my guest is Mislav. Mislav, say hello, and you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mislav Marohnić. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, and for the last 7 years, I've been at GitHub doing all kinds of different things.
So when people say GitHub, they immediately, think of open source. And full disclosure, the envy of the fact that you have like the most simple Twitter handle and the most simple GitHub handle, and we talked about it a little bit earlier because of the uniqueness of your name, but perfection is key. And when people think of GitHub, they think of open source. And I think one of the things I would love to talk about isn't just about GitHub, but how you got started in tech and kind of how you gravitated towards where you are right now. So one of the things that I'm always interested in learning is how you kind of got started with tech. Do you have a memory of like the first time, tech was you approached tech or you approached something? It doesn't have to be open source, but something where you're like, oh, computers, that's my thing forever now.
I think it was more gradual, so it wasn't an epiphany moment, but I can definitely pinpoint it to a time where I did, let's say I was around 20 years old and I tried to do graphic design. I was really into that. I don't think I was really good, but at least I had something to show for it. I wanted to build out a portfolio, so I wanted to put it up online. But I kind of didn't want to use any like out-of-the-box solution today that would be Squarespace site or Wix.com or something. I wanted to kind of make my own by hand. And I thought it was easy, and it turned out not so easy. So I'm there coding, and then I'm learning a scripting language called PHP. And suddenly at that point, I felt like it's something I can actually grasp. I wasn't feeling confident in, for instance, doing graphics design because there were so many people better than me. But in coding, I felt, wow, at least my brain can kind of understand this. And more I got involved in the open source world of PHP frameworks and eventually went into other languages, and the rest is history.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you were kind of a late entry into kind of tech, right? So you mentioned that you started out as a graphic designer. So what was kind of one of the major things that you wanted to get into graphic design? Was it you were always an artist as a child, or was it one of those things where you saw opportunity and you're like, oh, well, this is probably a pretty comfortable career if you can get a good job?
I don't think I was as much career motivated. I think even back then, as it is right now, I was always primarily motivated with everything that I learned in computers and tech. I just wanted to create something.
Sure.
This feeling of creativity, and I wanted to put it to some kind of use. And I think with graphics design, what fascinated me about it was the web page design, like people who did that really well, but also designing video games. And I understand that these are not very things that are very similar, but it was these fields where I really admired people when they did a good job, especially because in the end, I admire how simple something can be, how a truly an expert person can distill it down to the purest essence of simplicity. And now that I think back about how my works were, they were just overly complex. I would keep adding to them just for decor or something. And now in the meantime, I've learned that sometimes you need to stop to add things. And then when I transitioned out of that, or at least when I kind of started going more into coding and eventually found my first jobs doing coding, I tried to keep the same principle of like we can all add more code to it or include more libraries or something, but I try to apply the same thing of like the cleanliness and try to distill down every piece of code to not every, of course we sometimes have to ship, but when I have the time, I would try to often distill it down to its essence. And I feel that the things that I wrote in as my hobby, so not for work, where there was no any constraint for shipping or no expectations from anyone paying for the service, I would really sometimes obsess over minimizing things or taking the
Oh,
simplest approach. And that was my way of learning. Not actually code golf, you know how people do with code golf.
yep.
They take this approach to extreme. And I wouldn't necessarily be on those code golf sites or anything like that, but I would try to figure out how can we make this even simpler? How could we write even fewer lines of code? And I feel some of the things that I learned the best were some of the libraries that I put up on GitHub that try to be as simple as possible, and therefore forced me to really accept a certain limitation there.
Yeah, that's interesting because at least from my perspective as a developer, there's something that's very, very interesting about elegance in code, right? Like it's not just elegance in the effect that it's like the lines of code is small for a particular task, but the readability of it too. And you're probably witness to it too. I've read a lot of code where I know what it does, but I have no idea like what it does, right? Like if you look at, I don't know. So what's the name of that site? There's a site, I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but like you basically go through like programming exercises, and then like it gives you a particular use case, and then you're supposed to write some code, and then it runs your code against unit tests basically, and then gives you a score. And like one of the unit tests is like, how fast is it? And it seems like always the fastest way that you write your code is like with some crazy like reverse loop recursion that doesn't make any sense if somebody was to read it off the street, right? So I agree in the sense that like elegance in being able to write something that's like you can take a step back and you can like read it from top to bottom and you know exactly what it does, but also like somebody else can come to it, read from top to bottom, and know exactly what it does. That's elegance to me. I don't know if you feel a very similar way, or you like taking a 200 line function and turning it into like 22 lines or whatever.
Yeah, I'm totally great believer in code readability and the kind of elegance that you're describing as well. But I feel it only it's one dimension of the few dimensions that I kind of consider in my everyday life as coding, or that's either for work or for hobby. It's elegance is sometimes of the code readability as opposed to another component that is shipping actually.
Mm-hmm.
So completing the thing and make it actually usable. And so often people like me get so bogged down in supposed like elegance and readability that we actually forget to why we were doing this in the first place. And if there was a real business need, at some point we need to get it out there, because if I go in my hole and spent 10 years developing something and you never see any product of it, that wouldn't be good coding. That would be actually pretty bad coding. So we balance elegance and readability, we balance it with shipping. And another thing that you mentioned is speed, which is as you said, sometimes completely opposed to elegance, because to gain speed, we sometimes need to jump through weird hoops, and the end result could be really convoluted, but could be then fast for a CPU or forever needs to execute that. And I feel what we need to, our whole careers is knowing how to balance those things in an effective way.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's I remember in college I was taking it was a functional programming class, more or less, using Scheme, which is a programming language, a functional programming language. And I remember that I had a friend who his whole goal was to make this entire like project, or this entire program that was assigned to us, like one line. Like that was his goal. And like with Scheme in particular, like it's functional, but it's also based off of recursion. So like the idea of recursion is like built into the language itself, the idea. And he was able to do it, and like he showed it to me, and it was the most unreadable thing. And it's funny because my program, I remember, was like 20 lines. So like, and I'm not saying mine was like the most elegant thing, but he was able to do one line. And I remember the professor saying like, one of you wrote a one-line program that worked, I didn't understand a word it did. And this is somebody that's been in computer science for 40 years, right? So it's like, how useful is the ability to compress something down into one line, other than for just to be braggadocious, right? But I thought it was very funny because he was, like, to your point, obsessing over, like, it was that 2 lines. Like, oh, I know, like, if I can just get this piece and turn it into, like, this thing that needs this additional line, if I could wrap it up in something, it was funny. I just remember being very funny. And yeah, I mean, I think people in tech in general, and this is completely off the rails, but like, we tend to obsess about things like this, right? We get very stuck on a particular problem, whether it be like a problem with logic or a problem with implementation, and we stress about over and over and over again. And so do you have, I mean, as someone who's creative I'm the opposite. Like, I have like zero creativity. Like, for some reason I can write code very well, but like my creative sense as it pertains to for drawing, or I've been playing guitar for 15 years and I'm not very good at it. But I guess my point is I feel like most people in tech are either analytical or very creative. And do you feel like you have a little bit of both, or are you far more creative and the analytical side is a bit more challenging?
I think I'm a mixture of both.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when people know me from open source because they use some of my libraries and things like that, they often misattribute the creation of those libraries to me, because some of my most popular libraries, like for instance, in the Ruby and Rails world, people will remember Will Paginate maybe as a popular pagination library, and often think, wow, you created it, that's so amazing. And the story is, well, I didn't, I just took it over at some point and ran with it, but I invested so much of my time and additions, and I created everything after the initial idea, right? But this happened to me repeatedly through my career. So it's not always that I envision the full idea by myself, but I also don't put pressure on myself that I need to envision the full idea. I feel where my creativity comes from is combining an idea with also real world constraints. So for instance, there's somebody created a proof of concept and then later abandoned it. So my creativity would often be like, can we actually make it into something that has widespread use?
Yeah.
And in the end, I ended up being a maintainer of a lot of different projects that I myself haven't created, but I have created a lot on top of them and give them a whole future. So give them a future of years of maintenance and adding new features and adding plugins and documentation and things like that. So I balance out. I'm not a artistic machine in terms of code in a way that I see some of the people I admire in art being, like the person who made the painting behind me is my friend. But on the other hand, I'm also don't allow myself to get bogged down in procedurals as much as some people that I see online fighting over which technology is the best for X and Y, and forgetting that technology is just a very sophisticated hammer. And in the end of the day, you need something hammered down, and whatever makes you, whatever enables you to do it, you should make use of it.
No, I mean, that's very spot on, right? Like, I think one of the things that people tend to forget when they're writing code, like to your point, it's very interesting because everything's a nail when you have like a huge hammer, right? And I think one of the things that people really attempt to do in tech is solve every problem with the programming language or the concepts that they're very, very familiar with. And that doesn't work like 99.9% of the time, right? Like, you run into situations where I'm very guilty of it too, because I have a particular programming language that I'm in love with. And whenever I'm asked to do something that doesn't fit inside the scope of that language, I immediately start to sweat and panic. I'm like, okay, well, that means I have to go and do some Python development or whatever. And it's funny because I'm capable of writing code in JavaScript or writing code in Python or whatever, but like, it's outside of the comfort zone which I guess is always very funny for me, even though it's something that I could easily drop into a career in JavaScript development or in Python development or whatever. But it's like, no, it's not C#. Like I need it to be C#. I think it's probably just because
language you were.
Yeah, the language
you were saying is C#.
Yeah, and I think it's just because that I learned how to be a developer using C#, and like, I think, like your first love in romance and in people, like the first love in languages too, right? Like you run into situations where you fall in love with something because it was the first thing that you really learned how to do, and like that sensation of doing something and finishing something all without, needing a ton of help. Like the first time you do that with the language, I imagine you build like some interlocking like love and belief that this is me and this language were meant to be together forever. And other languages just step in the way of you being able to get closer and closer to the thing you love. And that's a really ridiculous thought, but like that's how I think about it, at least.
I feel sometimes that the kind of confidence that you talked about in a specific language, or this eagerness to use a specific, let's say, framework that we're really familiar with for the next project, is partly sometimes what give us strength, like a wind in our sails. It's like, yes, I'm gonna use this C# framework or React in JavaScript or something. People jump to a technology before they even consider whether it's a best fit, right? And partly it's what gives us energy, but like I just said, maybe it's not a best fit. So sometimes it's a double-edged sword. It can lead us to be obsessed with the technology and jumping, what's the English expression, ahead of the herd, but essentially kind of going too fast in the initial moments of when a clear-headed level way of thinking was needed to evaluate different approaches, right?
Yeah.
So I try to kind of hold the tools that I'm comfortable with, kind of hold them close and keep in mind that I do desire to use them if I can for the next project, and I would like an opportunity or any kind of excuse to use them again. But also there is this, as I keep repeating, the real world need, as in the end we will ship something for people who most likely will never have to be exposed to the underlying technology and ever have to know it when it's written. So if you write a program in C# and I write one that does the same in Go, the end consumer often, for them, doesn't matter. They mostly concerned with whether they can run it or whether it's stable and fast and does what it says on the tin. And so, like everything else in software, it's a balance. Like we should hold that feeling of kind of confidence in a certain tool, but also learn to sometimes let it go in the wind, like abandon it and let it float away and accept an idea that is outside of that, a new one perhaps or something.
I mean, that's crazy talk to me. Like you feel, so I guess I'm just far more connected to things. It seems to me like you have no problem with letting go of things that aren't working out for you. I don't have that ability. I'm very much like, I try to, back to your metaphor about a hammer, right? Like I'm always trying to, like, regardless of the nail, I have to hammer it. Like even if it's a screw, even if it's like a USB drive, like everything looks like a nail to me. So, I mean, I'm envious of the fact that you have like this ability to move on when needed, which I think is really valuable for tech folks, because like you said a bit earlier, like we can get very bogged down in things, especially like if there are things that we like truly feel like we need to solve as an individual, which is challenging because, sometimes some problems aren't solvable with the particular constructs that you're trying to do. And that puts yourself in a situation where you very much could, I don't want to say embarrass yourself, but you can, have an issue in ego right? And the issue in ego is never a good place to be, like regardless of tech, like in general, right? So, I mean, it's interesting that some people have the ability to let go and other people's don't. I guess that's just something that's I've always found very interesting.
I guess it's our responsibility not just to study the technology itself, but also to study ourselves as well. For instance, in jobs previous to GitHub, I feel like I have had some like much more ego attached to the stuff that I would write, and then if I seen in code that somebody undid it or refactored it or done it in a different way, I would react defensively, and you could kind of sense that from a PR where I'm commenting or why did you change this or something like that. And when we put each other on a defensive, when we have this kind of conflicts in a team, not that all conflicts are bad, but I think these like ego-driven conflicts, they can be particularly toxic in any kind of context, but in this context, it's just the software development process. And to unblock ourselves, the only way is to let go, because we're not going to win. Like if I want to overwrite your code and you want to overwrite my code, there's not going to be any winners there.
Exactly. I think also one thing it's very funny with that, especially when, in the world of open source, like everything that we do is out in the open. And if you have some project that other people are taking advantage of, like more than likely somebody, one, will either want to change your code, like via PR, or two, they will find some issue with their code they have and they'll create an issue. And like those things are very bad for the psyche if you have a particular mindset where it's like, this is my child, nobody can change it, nobody can question its legitimacy, right? I'm very guilty of that. Like I have an open source project that it's a lot. I don't want to say a lot of people use it, but a good fair amount of people use it, and it's one of those things that right now, like something isn't working and people are very like adamant that it needs to get fixed. And I'm just like, I need to figure it out. I need to do it in a way that makes sense to me. And I'm like trying to be very cautious about how I interact, because I don't want to come off as being a dick, right? And it's challenging at times, right? Because all I'm trying to do is just like provide value, and all they see is like, this thing that I want doesn't work the way I want it anymore, and this person who's supposed to fix it isn't fixing it fast enough, which is the downfall of open source, right? Like people become accustomed to just getting things like on demand, which is good and bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, so much is accessible. I can thank my whole career to the fact that so much open source software is available, to the fact that you can just download Ruby on your computer and run it and not have to pay any license fees or anything like that, that all of these libraries are available. But it's really true that when you're not actively maintaining it, I think what happens to people who are not active maintainers of some software, they forget that all of this was created by somebody. And they come rushing into your issue tracker demanding that something gets fixed on a very timely manner. Like, I need this done yesterday. They sound like the guy from a newspaper in all their American movie.
Sure.
And you have to explain to them, look, maybe I won't get to it in the whole next year. So unless you want to do it or somebody else, and they can't fathom the reality of the thing. So.
Yeah. I mean, it was so, and I'm probably like the person that I'm going to call out, I'm not going to say who they are, but they know exactly who they are if they actually watch the stream. They said in the chat, like Mo, maybe you should add logging to this. And in my head, I'm like, oh, I'm adding logging, and I'm well aware of what the issue is. I just haven't had the time to get to it yet. And they were like, proposing like, oh, you should implement this logging mechanism. And I'm like, you should look at the code and see exactly what I'm doing before you recommend me doing something else. Anyway, this is me ranting about being an open source maintainer, which is always fun for me. So, speaking of open source maintaining, right, like you are, would you say you're the program manager or lead developer or the owner or whatever of, the new GitHub CLI, right? Which, I mean, if for folks who haven't had the opportunity to play around with it, it is brilliant. Like I like you and I were talking before, is like I've been a pretty early adopter of it, and I remember it being like one or two functions that you could do, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, I don't know if I'm ever going to use it, but then I started using it more and more, and then now as more and more features get added to it, I'm finding that I use it almost as much, or in some situations more than like the actual like Git bash, which, I mean, that's crazy to say for developers. Like, what do you mean you don't use Git bash? You use like some other thing that's like a wrapper for Git bash. Like, that's not, what does that mean? But like, yeah, do you want to talk about a little bit about what the CLI is and how you came to, being on the team that runs that project?
Sure. So you asked what is my role in the team, and I'm not a lead of any kind. For instance, we have a project manager who's great, but that's not me. And I'm perfectly happy just executing other people's directions. What I brought to the team was this experience of having already maintained a different command line client for GitHub. So we took some of the things that worked in my experience from that whole history and then left some of the things that didn't work, like some design decisions that didn't age really well. And based on that, we went forward, and with the inputs of right now the team is 5. I would say it's been changing lately,
Sure.
so I don't want to say the wrong number, but it's 5 of us, and I feel what each of us brings in there is a different perspective of how GitHub CLI tools should be done, and then the end product is what you saw and what you used, and I think we're doing a pretty great job. And maybe more of a longer story of GitHub CLIs in general, the tool that was before the GitHub CLI was called Hub. And that tool has a very interesting history because people perceived it to be an official GitHub CLI.
Sure.
Because it was hosted under the GitHub org on GitHub, which kind of gives it this official status.
Yeah.
But that's where the officiality of it ended. So it's technically inside the org, but as to how much of GitHubbers other than me, and me when I was working initially on this project, I was not a GitHubber. So now you have this kid who is me, who doesn't even work at a company, maintain an official CLI, which was mostly just like a joke, not a joke script. It was serious, but it was like a proof of concept. It was a toy.
Yeah.
It was a water gun that you could wrap around your Git on the command line, and it kind of it made it more GitHub-y, right? And it was done by the then CEO of GitHub, but also just as a thing. It was never supposed to be a tool that people use officially to communicate with GitHub. And soon after, he just, we built a few features, he stopped maintaining it because it was a toy, right? So in swoop, I swooped into the project. I kind of wanted to add some of my features, and he was like, sure, here's the right access, and let's move it under the GitHub org. And I started committing to it, and I was working on it for a full decade, so for 10 years, adding features to it, solving bugs, and making it just more useful over time. And organically, the user base grew, and the perception of everyone who used that tool was this GitHub is officially standing behind this tool.
Yeah.
Kind of expecting maybe that it drives its direction, that it's being developed with inputs from more different GitHubbers. And it's true that eventually I was hired into GitHub. So eventually I was a GitHubber who was working on a Hub CLI, but I didn't bring my perspective as a GitHubber there. I mostly brought my previous perspective as just this guy who uses GitHub daily for my work. And I thought it would be a nice idea to add this silly little command to a thing, and I added it. And not all of those decisions were really great, and not all of those decisions would be, if they were vetted with anybody else from GitHub, would be actually approved. So eventually, I think to higher ups in GitHub, it dawned that maybe GitHub should have an actually maintained CLI, as in that there's a team that is involved, that we actually do user research, that the decisions are not just done by one geek like myself, but being more of a group decision.
Sure.
And then we formed the CLI team, and I was hired into it because I was just switching teams at the time, and it was a great opportunity for me to be able to work on something that was my previous open source project. And we came out with this tool, and I think it's just already I feel it's a better tool, and I feel that we can thank the fact that it was not just me who is maintaining a single thing, but that we people who've done the research, and we've done the user testing, and we've considered the accessibility aspects of it as well, which we're in the middle of also addressing. So there's this tool is going to be so much richer and accessible to wider range of people than the previous one was, and that's when I feel now deserves its official label the now label of being the official tool, because for the first time ever it reached that quality marking.
Yeah, and a little bit of backstory, like, so I used Hub, not to the extent that I've used GitHub CLI, but I remember using Hub, and just like the ability to instead of me having to go out to a browser and click 6 buttons to open up a PR, right? Like the ability to do it in one line is very valuable, right? And I didn't know this, and the fact that you gave me this story, it's like it wasn't maintained by GitHub really at all. It was maintained by really somebody who was outside of GitHub, even though it was under the organization. Because, it's funny, because as somebody who works at Microsoft, anything that's under the Microsoft organization, people immediately think it's the gospel as well. And I think that's very funny. But when it was announced that the CLI was coming out, I on the first bits came out, my first thought was well, doesn't Hub do all of this stuff already? And so it's great to hear that there was actual reasoning. We had people outside of the organization maintaining this repo, which had a lot of features. I didn't dig through a lot of the code, so I imagine a lot of the practices, if it's 10 years old, were probably not worthy of being newer ways to do things. But one of the things I really appreciate about the new CLI is that, it seems to me at least, that the conversations that are happening inside the repository are far more, I guess you could say, official. I think that goes to your point too. And I don't know if you take on this role just naturally because of your previous, but you're kind of quote unquote the face of the CLI, right? Because you're very active in issues and you're very active in the PRs, and you're very if you go to GitHub issues in the CLI, you see your name there a lot, right? And I think that. And I guess where I'm going with this is that it makes sense that your previous experience has kind of led you to that role, because even though you probably don't want to admit, you have an opinion on how GitHub CLI should operate.
I have opinions.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's very interesting how you notice that I'm up there more active. I would attribute it merely to the fact that I actually enjoy being connected with the community as much. I love hearing the stories of how they use it, understanding them. And I also have this previous experience of reading issues on a Hub repo for 10 whole years, and also absorbing all of those people's needs and gripes and frustrations with the tool. So in my head, all of these different perspectives come together, and I feel like I'm able to really empathize with when somebody has a problem, and when something is really unclear in the tool, especially when I see over and over people falling in the same trap inadvertently, maybe because of poor documentation or something. That really gets to me. That's also the reason why that would be the primary reason why I'm really active there. And I feel that maybe my colleagues, they could equally also be as engaged in issues, but I feel like I jump in so fast that they don't even get to, and then they kind of, it's not that they're not active there, but I feel that if I took over a thread, they feel that it's in good hands now, and that I think it's always get to the bottom.
Yeah, I think it's always good too for teams to have kind of, and this is not very fair, but the idea of a community manager, right? Somebody whose responsibility it is not to be the face of the program or whatever, but if somebody comes in and posts an issue, you have all this context, not just from on the current CLI, but on the on Hub as well, and in previous work that you've done. So it's easy for you. Plus, I imagine that you, as having all this experience, could easily just pull from your, okay, well, this is why, and this is this, and this is a great conversation to have. Not saying that everybody else on the team can't, but like you said, you like it a lot, so it's natural to you. And probably other people on the team, they're like, I'd rather just write code, right, instead of deal with people and issues. No offense to anybody that's on the team, but I know a lot of developers just want to write code and don't want to talk to people or like deal with like community aspects of running a project, right? Which, I mean, is fair. So with CLI, right, I'd like to get an idea from you as to, obviously Hub has 10 years of life, and, I don't want to say that it has far more features than CLI, but like, what's the long-term goal for CLI? Is the goal for it to be just have feature parity with Hub and then continue on to map against existing GitHub functions, or is it like, I guess what is the long-term goals of CLI?
Well, let me just answer a short no for the feature parity thing, because that was absolutely not initially our goal nor the long-term goal, precisely because a lot of the functionality and the kind of design of Hub being a Git wrapper, we really wanted to deliberately leave behind, as in not touching it with a 10-foot pole, because it was a whole can of worms to maintain a wrapper that, let's say, injects extra flags into an existing Git command. That is just really hard to maintain. So instead, our goals are first, until this point, was getting really exposing issues, pull requests, releases, and probably I'm forgetting something, but kind of those repository related concepts from GitHub that people are already familiar with, and putting them there in terminal where, for instance, if you're anyone like me, you already spend most of your time in there. So it's really convenient if they're already there. But a more longer term goal than what we have right now is to also like keep integrating the up and coming features around actions. For instance, secrets we just recently shipped. We are also doing more work with adding actions integrations, like be able to list your workflow runs and maybe rerun them and things like that. So to really focus on the features that make more sense to be in a terminal. And then we're kind of going to be adding one by one of the features that we really think make sense to be there where you're with your code. So it will be most of the things that are related to your code. For instance, inspecting a workflow run from GitHub Actions is something that is very related to your code, because you might have just pushed your code, right? That broke a build or something. And then you can be in your terminal or your IDE where you have integrated terminal in the bottom like VS Code, and you could be using GitHub CLI to like inspect what went wrong and never have to leave to a browser or something. And meanwhile, we're also working on it being more accessible to scripting use for automation or something. So that's positioned really well for a thing that you can rely on. Like, for instance, the AWS CLI, right? We have this AWS CLI or a set of CLIs. I don't remember if it's a single binary anymore, but it's just this indispensable Swiss Army knife where when dealing with anything under the AWS platform, like let's, for instance, S3 or something like that. So I feel that GitHub CLI wants to be that eventually, this kind of indispensable Swiss Army knife for automating things. You said that you use it from GitHub Actions, right? And we really want to focus on not just how it's able to use now, but to make it even better suited for scripting and to enable a little bit more advanced workflows with less of you having to rely on like an external JSON parser like JQ or piping it to a Python script, that you can just get more done straight through just its own commands, its own functionality. And that's something that we're gonna have more to offer in future releases.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's spot on. I think also I'm very much like, if there's an easier way to do something, I'm very much a fan of it. Like, for instance, me personally, I don't use GitHub Desktop a lot, but I use GitHub Desktop for one particular thing. If I need to check out a PR, like somebody has a PR for one of my repos, it's far easier for me to get that PR locally through GitHub Desktop than using Git Bash, right? It's just, for whatever reason, it's easier for me. If I have to run like multiple commands or multiple things or configurations, like I'd much rather do it through an interface. And one of the things I love about the CLI, GitHub CLI, is that the fact that pull requests, like, think about the workflow for a pull request. 1, you need a branch. 2, you need to go down to the UI. You have to do the thing. You have to not only like create the pull request, but then you have to like confirm that you want to open the pull request, right? Like, it's not just one thing. It's like 3 or 4 things at the end of the day. And like just being able to go like GHPR create blah, like makes your life substantially easier, right? And I know that, like me personally, like what I use it for a lot, and you mentioned this a little bit. I mentioned earlier than that is like for actions, right? Like I have 2 repos, right? So I own a project from Microsoft called Azure Tips and Tricks. Which is basically like a site that has like a bunch of different things that you can do in Azure. So there's a public repo for it, which hosts the GitHub pages, because it's hosted on GitHub Pages. But then I have a backend private repo where we build all the content. So what I do is if anybody creates like an issue or a pull request in the public repo, I use GitHub CLI to do the same thing over on the private one, and vice versa, right? So like I use it basically as like instead of me having to do something by myself, being able to do it in an automated fashion makes my life substantially easier. And I think that's, CLIs in general are made for that, right? Like you don't want CLIs to be overtly complex, because people are very scared of terminal-based things in general, right? Like unless you grew up like working off the command line, most people are like, nah, I don't want anything to do with that. So if you are going to have a CLI, it needs to be something that's very, like you said, accessible, which I think, thinking about accessibility first is extremely valuable, which I'm excited to hear about.
Yeah, I think that your observation that terminals environment is kind of treacherous is definitely also my experience.
Yeah.
And I speak from a position of a person who is really comfortable in terminals, in the sense that before I had my first Mac, I just had Linux. And even though Linux typically I had distribution that came with desktop, I would just have a full screen terminal open and spend most of my time in there. Most of my coding was there. All the tools that I run are there. I used to use for the longest time Vim there, and only now recently in the last year transitioned to try out VS Code. So for the first time, I'm using a text editor that's not inside the terminal.
Yeah.
And even after all of those experience, I still do blunders like try to put git commit -m and put a message in double quotes. And then that message includes a exclamation point.
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, an exclamation point inside double quotes is interpreted by the bash shell as something specific. That's not a literal exclamation point. And then I have this palm face moment. It's just like, I knew this happens to me like once a week, and I can only imagine how much things like that happen, like a wrong flag, a wrong command, or an error message is just undecipherable. I can only imagine how much that happens to other people. Terminals are really ruthless, and somebody who's starting out with tech in general right now, I would guide them actually more towards using tools like graphical tools like GitHub Desktop and an IDE or something, because I actually want them to, I think the primary thing they need to be at first is comfortable. And I feel that terminals are it's going to take you a long time to ever be comfortable with them. But for a lot of other people who are already in them or have strong reasons why they want to use them, that's who I make tools for.
Yeah.
I do not believe that GitHub CLI would be a great tool for every GitHub beginner out there who's starting out. In fact, for most of them, I would recommend, if they need to do work with Git, like making commits and pushing, I would actually recommend GitHub Desktop, a graphical tool. But there's this, not exactly a niche, but a subset of the GitHub users that are like me in a terminal and also need to do some automation tasks. Like, for instance, let's say that you're an org admin and you need to do something like a batch script run on every member of the org to check I don't know, like some validity of something. For instance, if everyone has 2FA enabled, we have that check integrated into GitHub web interface, but let's say that we don't, right?
Sure.
You would have to like do this check versus an API. And at that point, are you going to like start writing an API script from scratch in Python and figuring out how to authenticate? Or are you going to reach for a tool like GitHub Cli?
Yep.
This is why we're building it for uses like that. My favorite uses are like grabbing all issues that are labeled a certain label and then seeing if they have an X number of upvotes or something.
Sure.
That is something that is, some of these tasks are theoretically available through web, but not all of them will. But they're all definitely available through command line tools. And I love the versatility of those tools that you can then combine command with a command and pipe one into each other and really get down to specifics of what you're doing at that moment.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, and this is me probably, I'm guessing, so it uses the GitHub API behind the scenes, right? So at the end of the day, like, the goal is, like, if you can do something via the API that you would typically do, like, I know I'm guilty of it, like, I would curl the GitHub API with, like, a token, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, you could easily just GH auth, and then get your token behind the scenes and then make all of your commands instead of having to write some curl against some arbitrary URL that you hope will do what you want it to do, right? I mean, like your example is like, get me all the issues with this particular label and then order them by upvotes or whatever, right? Like that's something that I've done using the API lots of times. And like, I think of all the things that I have to do to make that work. And instead, it's literally one command with the CLI, which at the end of the day, like it goes to the beauty of like using command line tools because you can do like a lot with one command. But at the same time, like not everybody knows like that you can quit Vim with like :WQ, right? Like not everybody knows that. So like again, back to my point earlier, it's like if you are going to write tools that use command line, make sure that they're super easy because it just makes everything easier. Not only easy, but pluggable. Like if you have, like you said, like a Python script or a Bash script or whatever, and you're calling out, it's like, okay, instead of having all this REST nonsense to get to make an API call, you just call the CLI. Substantially easier, right?
Substantially easier. And also, let's say that you need to post a payload to our API. If you're writing a curl script, well, curl can out encode JSON for you.
Nope,
right?
It can't.
And what are your options from Bash? Well, there's none. You would have to shell out to Python script that then combines some JSON body or to maybe JQ or something. And for instance, with a GitHub API, just tell it these fields, post these fields and post them as JSON for you and basically saves you from having to do with the specifics of encoding. And there's this GH API, my favorite command is GH API, that works most of the same as Hub API script. That is just a mostly lightweight wrapper around the GitHub API.
Yeah.
You still have to know the endpoint names, and you still have to know what parameters they expect. Mm-hmm. But the details of authenticating and encoding, all of that is handled for you. So you still get this kind of feeling like being really close to the metal.
Yeah.
But a lot about the protocol authentication is already handled for you. And then you can focus on actually doing the thing that you wanted to do rather than figuring out how the hell do I, what content type does this endpoint expect?
Yeah,
how should I serialize this? So I feel that it kind of clears so much of the path for you. Then you can just kind of focus, okay, now I have this data. What do I do with it?
Plus, one thing, it removes a bunch of the boilerplate, right? Like, regardless of what technology you're using, like, making a REST call or an API call in general, like, it's substantially different per technology. Sometimes it's very easy. Like, Python makes it easy, or C# or JavaScript makes it fairly easy. But, like, Bash, like, it's not easy. Like, it's not very easy to, like you said, encode JSON, or even just, like, okay, like, I know this one particular API returns a blob versus this one returns JSON, which this one returns whatever, right? It's not simple. And, having a wrapper for it. And I think that was like the value of Hub, right? Is that you can just wrap all sorts of interesting things and get the same output, or at least the same formatted output. Same output format. But like you mentioned a few times that like Hub had its issues, and it's good to hear that there are certain things that are being carried over from Hub which are extremely valuable, but there's also a lot being left behind.
Yeah, for instance, the whole kind of extending Git part is what we left behind.
Yeah.
It's not to say that we don't want to extend Git. Like we do, GitHub Cli does really interface with Git in a sense that it does invoke a lot of its commands internally, right? But when I say extending Git, for instance, Hub had this thing in which you can say git merge some flags, right? And it gets merge an existing command, but Hub would take the some flags and add some kind of special GitHub meaning to some of them, or inject an extra flag in there, right? And that was an approach that really blurred the difference between what is Git and what is GitHub. And abstractions, they're a really powerful tool for anyone who's in software. They understand that they are mostly what we do with create and juggle abstractions, right? Calling out a library is basically admitting that this library is abstracted away complexity of doing a certain task, and that you are using it precisely for that, for the fact that it's an abstraction, right? But also we can get too carried away with those. And if there's a tool that wants to blur right now away the specific boundary between where Git begins or starts and ends, and where GitHub starts, that's could potentially be like a very powerful abstraction, but it's too early for it. It needs to be done with it needs to be done in a way that it can't just be like a fever dream of a single developer in his room. It needs to be done very consciously over a long period of time by multiple people who have done a lot of research. So I tried to abstract some of the things away from Git. In the end, what happened is that people forgot which one is the Git command and which is the Hub command and which is the Git flag and which is the Hub flag, right? And when they change tools or upgrade Git, some of those things then came at odds with each other and started like crashing, and it was a nightmare to maintain. In the end, it just proved to be a very bad idea for an abstraction. So when we started what with GitHub Cli, we didn't want to offer you any enhanced Git commands.
Sure.
You still have your whole arsenal of Git commands on your disposal, but you just need to write Git in your terminal, and then whatever commands you're familiar with Git. And in the future, we might want to wrap them in an abstraction. Let's say an abstraction around committing or making branches, right? To be able to, right now, for you to be able to open a pull request with GitHub Cli, you still need to use Git to make a branch, to create commits on it, and then you can use GitHub Cli to make a pull request, right? But you needed to use Git or GitHub Desktop or something like that to do your work in the first place. Well, in the future, we might want to consider to capture the whole flow from GitHub Cli, so that you don't have to maybe be aware that you've just made a thing called a commit, or that you just created a thing called a branch, but to maybe capture it as in like you wrote some code and you saved some code and now you shared some code, right? But this is a very risky thing to distance ourselves from those words, like a commit on a branch. Because if we don't execute this perfectly, we just end up confusing a lot of people. So it will be like more of a longer term dream for our tool, and we're going to only attempt it if we're really certain that we can do something that is more valuable to users, but also doesn't leave them disoriented and lost and eventually locked into only being able to use our tool and not knowing how to use any other alternative tools.
I mean, that's awesome, and I'm glad to hear the team is thinking about these sort of things, right? As a user, like I said, I've been very, very happy with it, and I'm just excited to see, more and more being added to it, because like I said, it is it's great. It makes my life substantially easier. So I want to thank you for, working on something that I use, right? Because it's not very often that we come across tools that help your productivity. And I think the CLI, at least for me, has definitely helped with my productivity.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
Yeah. And so as we wrap up, like one of the things that I love to ask our guests before we finish up is, if you could describe open source or your, relationship with open source in one word or one small phrase, what would that be? No pressure.
I have the word that comes to mind, but it was a while ago since I've seen this talk, and now I will not able to attribute it to the correct person who originally said it. But basically, this person was quoting another person who seems like has been his influence in tech or something like that, who was saying that a specific open source community is acting on love. Okay. As in like a love for a specific thing. Let's say if so many people contribute to Linux kernel, of course, a lot of it is necessity as well. But mostly these people opted into this necessity, right? People came together and created something that is has real world applications, but also builds a community, gives people a sense of belonging, gives you validation for your skills. All of those things are kind of equally valuable when it all comes together, because at the end of the day, then we create amazing things. So I would say, paraphrasing this person will paraphrase another person, I would say that open source is an expression of that feeling of longing and unity we feel for each other. That is a very innately what we consider a very human trait, right? I don't want to say too much generalizations about humans, because I don't like it when other people do that in a weird way. But I would definitely say something that I think most of us can agree, and that is one of our strengths is that when we come together.
That's great.
For instance, rockets. Everybody's fascinated about rockets, right? I have this feeling that no single person can actually build and launch a rocket on the whole planet.
Yeah, of course.
But if you get a bunch of people to build and launch a rocket, suddenly we have actual rockets being launched successfully into the atmosphere, into space. So I feel that same sense of like togetherness and belonging and like co-creating something really maps well to what I think is the pulse of the open source community, that precisely the same thing happens. But in this case, it's even kind of more casual. It's people from their bedrooms at night, like doing little weird creative projects or libraries, and eventually the library gets included in another one, which takes it in a different direction, and that takes into another one. It's this endless remixing, like everybody's DJing instead of music, we're DJing code. And for me, well, it's all about that. It's definitely the primary reason why I'm so active in this space as well.
That's awesome.
I get to benefit from it as much, and then we can only just give back as well. As the least that we can do.
No, that was great. I'm thankful for your thought, and like that quote that you mentioned, I think that's very spot on, right? It's like it goes on like it's cliche almost, right? That's like, we do things because we love them, but like it's not said enough, right? I think that's one thing that's very true, and I thank you so much for explaining it as well. So again, Mislav, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. This was great. It was great talking about your experience in open source and obviously some cool things that are going on with the CLI. So I want to thank you so much for your time. Do you have any parting words?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope that people hearing this can be inspired to, if you haven't already, to kind of join in and try to figure out what value can you add yourself, because everybody can.
That's great. Everybody can add value. So again, if you want to take advantage of the CLI, it's definitely available. Is it technically still in beta, Mislav, or is it officially? Yeah, it's no longer in beta, so you don't have to even worry about non-production bits. It's officially been shipped, so please take advantage of it. So that will do it for our episode of Coffee and Open Source this week. Thank you so much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Take care.